Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. The Plymouth Brethren Christian Church (PBCC) is a Christian sect led by Australian businessman Bruce Hales. The group has its origins in Exclusive Brethren, a Plymouth Brethren group, itself a branch of the Open Brethren. The PBCC was established in the early 19th century. At this time, many Christians were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the Anglican Church with its forms and customs. Some of the most prominent teachers of the Brethren were living in Plymouth. By 1829, the first permanent meetings were held in simple meeting rooms, and these gathering places became known as those of the Plymouth Brethren. There are now over 50,000 people who identify as members of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. These people are spread across 17 countries, including Australia. In 2012, the group incorporated under the name Plymouth Brethren Exclusive Brethren Christian Church Limited. Beliefs and practices. The PBCC believe that God's principle of unity is achieved by separating from that which they consider evil. Members of the group do not engage with television, radio, and the open internet. The Brethren reserve all social activities for those with whom they celebrate the Lord's Supper, their name for the Eucharist, excluding even family who are not members of the church. Social activities include eating, drinking, and entertainment. Eating in restaurants and staying at hotels, club and professional memberships, directorships, and shares are avoided. Services on Sunday start with the Lord's Supper at 6 a.m. and worship in small groups. At 10:30 the Bible study meeting is held, and other activities continue throughout the day. There are further meetings every night of the week. 2 of their services are closed to those who are not members in good standing, the Lord's Supper and the monthly care meeting. However, they do hold 10 services a week, 9 of which are open. Well-disposed members of the public are free to come to their gospel preachings and other meetings. In practice, most gospel preaching has been done on street corners, and although they do not seek to make converts, the desire is to spread the word of God and its benefits for mankind. The addresses of senior Brethren men are recorded, transcribed by the Brethren Publishing House in the UK, and distributed to all members at a subsidized cost. The Brethren encourage a traditional marriage and family life. Children live at the family home until they marry and are required to marry within the fellowship. Physical contact between young men and women before marriage is not tolerated, and courting between couples is chaperoned. Men are expected to provide for their families while the women manage the household. A study of the Australian Brethren in May 2006 suggested that the number of divorced, single people in the Brethren is approximately 0.8% compared to 10.8% for the general population, although there have been a few separations without divorce. The aged and sick are usually cared for by other member families, possibly unrelated, although private non-Brethren nursing homes are sometimes utilized for the elderly. Few people not born into the Brethren become members, and relatively few of those born into the group leave. Former members say that life inside the Brethren is defined by the 3 F's: family, finances, and fear. The strongest is family. Few who remain in the church would agree that fear is a defining factor, though. Women are somewhat subservient to men. They sit behind the men in meetings, and their service is to select hymns, not to pray out loud or teach. They wear a scarf or ribbon in their hair to signify that the man is head of the woman. Brethren businesses are generally run by men, but some women do run their own businesses, are shareholders or directors in family companies, or actively work in the family business. Brethren members can drink alcohol at home, but being visibly drunk is frowned on, and smoking and gambling are forbidden. Discipline. Critics of the PBCC have accused it of controlling all aspects of its members' lives. The group's influence over its members is such that many who have left the group have had trouble adjusting to life outside. According to the PBCC, the sect's disciplinary methods consist of shutting up or temporary isolation, and withdrawing from or excommunication. The church asserts that such measures are infrequent and only come about after long periods of pastoral care, and only when persons persist in behaviors which are against the principles set out in the Holy Bible. However, there are examples of persons being withdrawn from for infractions, such as disagreeing with the man of God. A person who is withdrawn from is excommunicated and cut off from their family and community. In practice, former members say that these disciplinary measures are often used by the PBCC's highly centralized leadership as a means of control, for instance, quelling dissent or questioning of the leadership. Leaving the fellowship. Leaving the PBCC involves significant sociological changes, including the termination of family and social support, psychological, cultural, and identity issues, the loss of employment, and in many cases disinheritance. The impact of these changes has been described as clinical culture shock. The PBCC asserts that excommunicated members are now carefully followed up to make sure they are not living in destitution, although it conceded this has not always been the case. This claim is disputed by former members, including in testimony to the UK Charities Commission in the period 2012-2014. Within the PBCC, those who leave are regarded as having chosen the world and the devil against God, and separation is required because they could bring members into contact with differing views and behaviors. When someone chooses to leave the brethren or is excommunicated, their parents, siblings, spouse, and even children are required to withdraw or disassociate themselves from them. This allows for no socializing from church members. Since almost all members work in other members' companies, being excommunicated may also mean that they have to give up their jobs, in addition to their family and their home. Business. Typically, brethren either own their own business or work for a business run by another brethren member. Their businesses include manufacturing, distribution, and sales, including in the fields of clothing, architecture, rehabilitation, aids, and food, and the import and resale of industrial hardware, including welding equipment and consumables. Trade unions are not permitted, and the brethren have even successfully fought regulations that permit unions to visit workplaces to talk to employees. Brethren companies use computers, fax machines, and mobile phones, but there is guidance so that sites considered perverse and morally degrading are totally blocked. Brethren run private schools for their children between the ages of 8 and 18. Members are strongly discouraged from attending university because of the campus environment. However, many undertake tertiary studies through distance learning, completing diplomas or degrees, typically focusing on accountancy or business studies rather than the arts. In 2005, David Bell, the Chief Inspector of Schools in England, praised the Brethren schools for their standard of teaching and said in his report that the quality of teaching, most of which is done by experienced practitioners, is generally good. Because of the lack of tertiary education, the teachers are not brethren. Their schools do use computers and other modern technology, and their use of Zoom and self-directed learning has enabled them to cope with the COVID-19 virus. Brethren schools have computer banks, and students have restricted access to the internet. They now embrace a wide range of technology, and most students are supplied with a laptop, and all schools have equipment for video conferencing, which is used extensively. There are 38 Brethren private schools throughout Australia and 43 in the United Kingdom, 36 in the United States and Canada, as well as others throughout the world. As with many private schools in Australia, Brethren schools qualify to receive Australian federal government funding. In 2007, the Victorian state government provided $1.08 million in funding to the Glenvale Exclusive Brethren School, which has a dozen campuses in Victoria. This was a significant increase from $370,419 in 2002-03. In the United States and Canada, private schools are operated by Sterling Education, Inc., which is closely affiliated with the PBCC. History. The Plymouth Brethren were distinguished from the beginning by a refusal to accept ministers or priests, believing that all members were saints, although in practice John Nelson Darby became increasingly dominant in the exclusive branch of the movement during his lifetime. It was not until James Taylor Sr. became undisputed leader of the Raven faction in 1910 that a stricter hierarchy emerged by which discipline was imposed and the center of power moved to New York, where Taylor lived. He established a norm that someone in leadership should be in their own business, not an employee, although Raven had been a civil servant and began to speak of certain brothers as Levites or the Lord's servants, who were especially able to interpret biblical truths. In America, James Taylor of New York was beginning to be seen as Raven's future successor as early as 1897, and when Raven died in 1905, books of his sermons began to be reprinted around the world. By the time another letter from Melbourne was received in 1920, resulting in the departure of 40 assemblies mainly in Australia, the London faction was also known as the Taylor or Raven-Taylor Party. By 1929, it was alleged that Taylor was denying one of the main orthodoxies of Christianity, that Christ the Son was truly God before his incarnation. Taylor had pointed out that the title of the Son was not used till after the incarnation, pointing to John 1 as the Word, not the Son, denying the eternal sonship. This was reflected in the issuing in 1932 of a new version of the Little Flock hymn book, always a touchstone of Brethrenism. 40% of the hymns in the older version were omitted as inconsistent with the truth. When James Taylor Sr. died in 1953, there were two candidates for the leadership: Taylor's youngest son, James Taylor Jr. (1899–1970), and Gerald R. Cowell (1898–1963) of Hornchurch, Essex, UK, who struggled for 6 years for supremacy. At the Central Hall Conference in 1959, a decisive confrontation took place between Gerald Cowell and James Taylor Jr. The latter proposed that more radical, immediate separation from the world was necessary, while the former took a more moderate line. James Taylor Jr. wanted excommunicated Mr. Cowell less than a year after the conference, judging him unfit for Christian fellowship. During the next 10 years, Mr. Jim delivered hundreds of new edicts, demanding strict obedience on how people dressed, how they conducted their business, and banning beards and young people from attending university. Members were forbidden to eat with others, even family members who were not in the movement, and they were not allowed to join professional associations. A considerable number of individuals and assemblies left the exclusives during the ministry of James Taylor Sr., and even more under the leadership of James Taylor Jr., chiefly as a reaction to the increasingly restrictive directives of the latter. Some of these leavers joined with other groups of brethren, including others who left after 1970 or other local churches. The Aberdeen incident of 1970. Scandals began to appear in newspapers around 1961, but little concrete information came to light until after the so-called Aberdeen incident of 1970. In that year, opposition to James Taylor Jr. personally came to a head in meetings at Aberdeen in Scotland on 25 July, at which he appeared to be drunk. Very few based near the scene of the events stayed in fellowship with James Taylor Jr., including just 2 families in Aberdeen and 200 out of 3,000 in Scotland. Others, especially those overseas, believed Taylor's supporters' line that he was a pure man and that this incident was used by God to expose his enemies. James Taylor Jr. died shortly afterwards the same year. The Taylor Brethren interpretation of events is rooted in the conviction that God had a vessel whom he would not allow to fail. Taylor spoke and acted as he did to bring out what was in others by provoking reaction, being willing to draw reproach on himself to do so. This account of the Aberdeen incident is disputed by some researchers. The Italian Center for Studies of New Religions, Cessner, has this to say about it. Translation from French: the first episode relates to the previously mentioned Aberdeen Conference in 1970, where a Taylor Jr., old and exhausted, he died the same year, was accused not only of criticizing some opponents but also of a moral fault. There is convincing evidence showing that these accusations are false and that they were launched as part of a campaign to destroy. Following this incident, Those who separated from James Taylor Jr. continued to hold the doctrine and teaching of Taylor Sr. but rolled back the directives that had been introduced during James Taylor Jr.'s leadership. This fellowship further fragmented in 1972, and the party which broke away has since further subdivided. Developments since 1970. After Taylor Jr.'s death, leadership passed to James H. Symington, a farmer from Netch, North Dakota. J. H. Symington died in 1987, and shortly after, the leadership passed to Australian John S. Hales. Hales had been trained as an accountant and did not encourage the faithful to make substantial donations to the sect out of their estates when they died. He established Brethren-only high schools around the world, starting with one in the Sydney suburb of Meadowbank. In 2002, John S. Hales died, and his son Bruce David Hales, another Australian businessman, succeeded to the leadership. For the second time in exclusive history, the position of universal leader was transferred to a son from his father. In 2004, Hales reversed a long-standing Brethren tradition on political involvement and encouraged the church to support conservative political causes. In the U.S., large donations were given to the George W. Bush campaign. In Australia, support was given to John Howard, and in New Zealand to the National Party. Internal rules are being relaxed, the dress code is breaking down, and access to technology is widely allowed. Hales travels the world in a chartered Cessna Citation executive jet at a cost of up to $5,000/hour. Under Bruce Hales's leadership, meetings continue to take place once a day from Monday to Saturday, and 4 or 5 times on Sunday. Sunday meetings include Lord's Supper, Holy Communion at 6 and Sunday, a scripture reading/discussion meeting, and several preachings. The church encourages participation at meetings by all adult males. Brothers, women, sisters may only choose and announce give-out hymns, and apart from joining with group singing, are otherwise silent in church meetings as required by the Brethren's interpretation of 1 Corinthians 14:34. In 2012, the Preston Downs Trust, a Plymouth meeting room in England, attracted considerable media attention when the Charity Commission rejected an application for charitable status on the grounds that it could not be sure that it met the CRO. In January 2014, they announced that, following legally binding changes to its trust documents, they would accept its application. Criticism. Kevin Rudd, who was later elected as the Prime Minister of Australia, said in 2007, "They split families, and I am deeply concerned about their impact on communities across Australia." Despite his earlier criticism, in 2009 Rudd wrote the foreword for a book published by the group as a fundraiser for the Country Fire Authority and described the Brethren School as a resilient community coming together in response to this crisis. Charity work. Rapid Relief Team Australia. The Rapid Relief Team RRT was established in Australia in 2013 by the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church (PBCC). The RRT offers quality catering assistance to charitable and government organizations confronting some of humankind's greatest challenges, including natural disasters, heart disease, cancer research, and the plight of the homeless. The teams are composed of volunteers from the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. RRT teams are ready for the unexpected. When natural disasters strike, RRT are at the behest of government emergency services to offer support to those affected by adversity. RRT actively supports many honorable charitable organizations across the globe through fundraising events of our own or via catering support at government or charity events. The Rapid Relief Team has expanded into a global charitable organization with teams in the United Kingdom, North and South America, the Caribbean, Canada, New Zealand, and Europe. The organizational chart has been replicated in every region globally to ensure uniformity across the operations. The teams are generally of a similar size and work to a consistent standard with established protocol. To date, the RRT in Australia has held 1813 events across the country, with the support of 22,712 Plymouth Brethren volunteers, putting in over 105,000 hours to produce 482,312 meals. The most recent project of the RRT Operation Drought Relief. Exclusive Brethren and the media. The PBCC Brethren have been the subject of quite widespread controversy and adverse publicity at various times since the mid-1960s. Other exclusive brethren are normally ignored by the media, but loathe the confusion caused by mistaken association with this group and careless use of the broader term exclusive brethren. In early 2007, the Brethren began interacting with the media and appointed an official media representative. A number of documentaries have been made about the exclusive Brethren. These include Anno Domini Doctrine, that divides a BBC television program now, LRP 1383, first broadcast 26 September 1976, and Inside New Zealand, Leaving the Exclusive Brethren aired in New Zealand on TV3 Thursday, 18 August 2005. The Inside New Zealand, Leaving the Exclusive Brethren documentary followed the experiences of 5 people who had left the Brethren. Shortly after its airing, Michael Powell submitted a complaint to the television station TV3 stating that the program had breached the privacy of members of the Brethren and was unbalanced, inaccurate, and unfair. Upon review of the issues, the New Zealand Broadcasting Standards Authority rejected the complaint on 22 February 2006. Political involvement. In general, exclusive brethren are apolitical since at their core they are a separatist movement. They will obey the laws of their country as long as they do not perceive them to contradict the Bible. They will meet secretly in countries that require religious groups to register with the government, as this would be perceived as putting their church under worldly authority. In accordance with the dispensational teachings of John Nelson Darby, they view an apocalyptic future for humanity after the rapture of all Christians, brethren and non-brethren. Thus, they see no reason to be involved in politics because of the prophesied apocalyptic future that cannot be changed. There is a story among the exclusive brethren of a woman member who decided to vote every year and informed her husband of her candidate choices. In response, her husband voted for the exact opposite candidates to ensure the 2 votes canceled each other out. In recent years, the PBCC have modified this stance and have become more involved in politics, though until recently their activity was limited to behind-the-scenes lobbying of politicians. On the basis of religious conviction, they have since the 1940s asked for and obtained exemptions to trade union legislation, both membership and representation in brethren businesses, compulsory voting laws, and lobbied on abortion and homosexuality. The Brethren made media headlines in 2005-06 with their political activities in both Australia and New Zealand, despite the fact that members are barred from voting in elections, even in countries that have compulsory voting. But lately, Brethren members have been encouraged to work with elected officials to express a moral viewpoint of legislation in relation to the rights of God. In recent times, this has included political campaigning as detailed below. In an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald, Daniel Hales, brother of Bruce Hales, explained how they could support political parties and not vote. "I see it as a sin and you don't. So I'm very happy for you to vote because to you it's your obligation to the community. But to me it's my conscience that doesn't allow me to vote." Australia, Canada. In 2005, the Brethren attempted to influence a gay marriage parliamentary vote by waging an anonymous campaign identifying themselves only as CCP or Concerned Canadian Parents using direct mail and advertise. A Parliament Hill Weekly directed at senators studying Bill C-38. New Zealand. Sweden. The Swedish tabloid newspaper Aftonbladet alleged that the Brethren funded an advertising campaign supporting the centre-right Alliance for Sweden in the Swedish 2006 elections. The advertisements and flyers were distributed by Nordis Sverige, an agency set up by Swedish business owners who, while members of the Brethren, acted on their own initiative. Aftonbladet traced it to a company named Nordis Limited operating from Liverpool, UK, run by business owners, also members of the Brethren. United Kingdom. Controversy over the Brethren in Britain revolves around the alleged practice of shutting up, where families or persons are confined to their homes, and is used to punish members who break rules. In May and July 2012, 6 girls from the independent Wilton Park School were allegedly confined for 37 days after making a Facebook page. This claim was denied by the school trust, who subsequently invited the local authority to investigate. Investigation later found the complaint groundless. United States. In 2004, the exclusive Brethren held prayer meetings and took out newspaper ads supporting the re-election of George W. Bush as President of the United States. A committee called the Thanksgiving 2004 Committee, formed by Brethren in Florida, raised $530,000 for the ads supporting the re-election of Bush and of United States Senator Mel Martinez of Florida. $377,262 of this amount came from a single donor, Bruce Hales of London, England. The committee raised none of the money in Florida, according to a report filed with the Federal Elections Commission. A White House spokesman later described the group as shadowy. Secrecy. The Brethren have been accused of using defamation lawsuits to silence their critics. In 1984, the Dutch Open Brethren theologian Willem Ouweniel prepared to publish a German translation of his book about the history of the whole Brethren movement, in which he discussed the Aberdeen incident. The exclusives brought a suit on the basis that they felt offended. The case was heard and settled out of court, but he never published the German version, though he claims he had simply told the truth. In 1992, they brought a $3.02 case against New Zealand MP Nick Smith for his determined questioning of their behavior in a family custody case. The case ended without a payment, and the Brethren later apologized for the action. In 1997, an ex-member, Dick Wyman, opened a basic guest book-type site which allowed former members to get in contact with each other, and eventually became www.exclusivebrethren.net. In 2004, the Brethren filed a defamation suit against Wyman in the Minnesota District Court. Faced with the prospect of massive legal costs, Wyman decided to settle, taking down the site and promising never to start another or pass on the information, while the Brethren paid him some compensation. A similar site withdrawn from com lasted only months when it was added to the Wyman case. A new site, PBCC.net, was started up by a database specialist, Tim Twinning, who lived in a log cabin in Vermont and took advantage of the possibility of anonymous ownership of websites in California. This grew to be the largest ex-Brethren site, with 597 members vetted for genuineness. It had several levels of security, allowing for greater privacy, an emergency button for those considering leaving or committing suicide with a worldwide panel of volunteers who could be contacted, and provided a clearinghouse for news about the Brethren. In 2005, Brethren's publishing house, the Bible and Gospel Trust, started fishing expeditions to flush out who was responsible by threatening lawsuits against likely candidates. Eventually, they found out and launched a copyright violation suit against Twinem in Vermont in 2007 over obscure documents that were allegedly published on the site, claiming $500,000 damages. After trying to fend it off on his own, Twinem had to employ legal help, pointing out that this was a classic slap tactic. A settlement was reached in 2009 which allowed the site to continue, but the Brethren continued to pursue him, and in early 2013 the site descended into a permanent maintenance mode, possibly connected with a serious illness that Twinem was suffering. At least one other website has appeared to replace it. Notable PBCC members. NB. The following individuals were associated for at least part of their lives with the religious movement that has been known since 2012 as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. Prior to 2012, it was not formally known by this name and was commonly known informally as the Raven Taylor Exclusive Brethren. Anthony Crossland, Foreign Secretary in Britain's Labour government, raised in Plymouth Brethren. Maternal grandson of F.E. Raven. L.C. R. Duncombe Jewell, raised in the Plymouth Brethren. John George Haig, serial murderer. David Hendricks, convicted of killing his wife and children but acquitted in a retrial. Watchman Nee, respected leader in the Little Flock movement in China, after being excommunicated by exclusive brethren for breaking bread with sectarians. James Taylor, Jr., leader of One Brethren branch, aka Taylorites, from 1953 to 1970. Anger Thomas wrote the book, Behind Closed Doors, about her childhood abuse in the exclusive brethren.